Welcome to my Hidden Truths channel. A 7-year-old child walks into the morning mist, only to find a freshly built wooden fence blocking the pasture his family has used for generations. Centuries later, a family receives a foreclosure notice and packs their lives into boxes while a bank reclaims their home. Today, a worker watches their skill, language, and style absorbed into a machine they do not own, replaced by the very data they generated. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The fence changes shape. Once it surrounded the common field. Later it surrounded the factory clock, the colonial port, the rented home, the platform database, and the AI model. Every time, the same question returns. Who owns the thing that everyone needs to live? This video runs a little long. If you stay with me to the end, you might see modern life for what it actually is. Not a random collection of crises, but a repeated history of enclosure. Chapter 1. The Fence That Started the Modern World. In the year 1593, in the quiet English village of Kotzbach, a 7-year-old boy leads his sheep out into the morning chill. As the fog begins to lift, he stops and stares at a strange new structure rising from the damp earth. A heavy wooden fence now cuts directly across the open pasture. His sheep are trapped on one side, but the grass they need to survive has been locked away on the other. Before that wooden barrier appeared, the concept of survival in the English countryside relied on a vast and delicate web of shared customs. Families did not hold exclusive private deeds to massive tracts of pasture. Instead, the village shared the meadows, the deep forests, and the uncultivated wastelands. These common areas provided grazing for animals, fallen firewood for the bitter winters, and a vital safety net for the poorest residents. You might not have owned the soil beneath your boots, but the land kept you alive just the same. This system was not a paradise, but it offered a fundamental guarantee of existence without demanding rent in return. The sudden appearance of the fence was not merely a change in agricultural management. It was a violent shock to the human nervous system, signaling that access to life itself was being permanently redefined. The driving force behind this transformation was an exploding European demand for raw wool. Landlords looked at their vast estates and calculated a very cold, precise mathematical truth. A single acre of land dedicated to growing grain for peasants produced merely a fraction of the profit that the exact same acre could generate if it were given over to grazing sheep. The ancient social contract was immediately sacrificed to the market. To maximize this new profit, the landlords needed massive, uninterrupted expanses of green pasture. The scattered strips of tenant farming and the shared commons stood directly in the way of this economic optimization. They began to systematically push the peasant population off the land, tearing down ancestral homes and enclosing the open fields. This brutal displacement became known to history as the Enclosure Movement, and it fundamentally altered human destiny. The English philosopher Thomas More observed this catastrophe unfolding and wrote a phrase that still carries a deep, unsettling resonance. He remarked that sheep, which were once so tame and satisfied with so little, had become so greedy and wild that they were now devouring men. This was never a literal fairy tale about predatory animals. It was a terrifying description of how capital behaves when it discovers a more profitable use for the earth. The wool profits literally swallowed the homes, the fields, and the basic survival rights of the rural population. The people were driven out into the muddy roads, stripped of their history and their means of sustenance. We often assume that modern wealth began with peaceful merchants simply trading goods and saving their honest coins. But the foundational wealth of the modern world was quite literally extracted by clearing the ground of human beings. Those who were expelled could only look back at the wooden posts dividing the green hills, slowly realizing the absolute finality of their loss. The new system did not care if your grandfather had planted the oak tree near the creek. It only cared about who held the formalized right of exclusion. The logic of the market had arrived, replacing the moral economy of the village with the cold calculus of the ledge. To the landlords, this sweeping enclosure was simply an act of rational management and necessary modernization. They believed they were rescuing idle land from inefficient peasants and putting it to its highest and best use. The fence was a monument to their own economic progress. But to the families standing on the outside of the barrier, shivering in the dawn mist, that same fence was an instrument of profound and immediate violence. This tension between efficiency and survival is the original wound of the modern economy. The fence did not simply draw a border in the dirt. It created a permanent boundary inside the human mind. It taught us to view the earth not as a shared inheritance, but as an exclusive financial asset. The soil was no longer a secure place to live, but a heavily guarded machine designed to generate a continuous financial yield. The wooden posts did not merely divide the soil. They divided humanity into those who owned the means of life and those forced to rent them. Chapter 2. Primitive accumulation was not peaceful saving. A wealthy merchant sits in a quiet, warmly lit room, carefully stacking gold coins on a polished oak desk. Miles away, a desperate farmer stands in the freezing mud, handing over his family's final plow to a debt collector just to pay the month's rent. We are often taught that the modern economic system began with the merchant's virtue, assuming that capitalism was born because a few hard-working individuals patiently saved their pennies. This comfortable story insists that the world is divided into two types of people. There are the diligent, frugal savers who accumulate wealth, and the lazy, wasteful spenders who eventually lose everything. If you believe this fairy tale, then poverty is simply a personal moral failure, and extreme wealth is the just reward for historical patience. But the true origins of our economic system look nothing like a peaceful piggy bank. The real foundation of modern wealth was built on a brutal historical process that Karl Marx identified as primitive accumulation. This concept completely shatters the myth of innocent saving. Primitive accumulation is not about stacking money in a vault. It is the deliberate, historical process of violently separating the original producers from the physical means of their own production. Wealth alone does not create a capitalist system. A feudal lord might possess mountains of gold, silver, and jewels, but that treasure does not automatically spark an industrial revolution. To fundamentally alter an economy, you must alter the relationship between human beings and the earth. You have to strip away the peasant's direct access to the soil, the artisan's ownership of their independent tools, and the community's shared rights to the local forest. As long as a family can grow their own wheat, raise their own sheep, and cut their own firewood, they will never willingly walk into a dark factory to sell their bodies for pennies. They possess a thin but vital layer of economic autonomy. To create a system where millions of people must sell their labor by the hour, that autonomy must be systematically dismantled and permanently destroyed. Therefore, the most essential accumulation was not the hoarding of capital, but the accumulation of displaced human beings. The system required a vast population of people who had been entirely separated from the resources required to keep themselves alive. This is why the transition from a traditional agrarian society to an industrialized economy required a period of absolute social upheaval, leaving millions without any independent means of survival. We can see the exact same logic operating beneath the surface of our lives today. When a modern corporation buys up independent farms, local mechanics, or family-owned restaurants, it is not merely acquiring real estate. It is steadily separating ordinary people from the capacity to produce value independently. The small business owner is slowly transformed into a wage earner, managing a branch of the very monopoly that bought them out. Think about how difficult it has become to own the tools of your own trade. Software developers are tethered to proprietary platforms. Delivery drivers must lease vehicles from the algorithms that assign their routes. And creative freelancers rent the software necessary to produce their art. The tools of production are perpetually leased, ensuring that the worker can never truly own the means to secure their own independence. This separation creates a deep, lingering anxiety that defines the modern condition. When you do not own the ground you stand on or the tools you use to survive, your existence feels permanently precarious. You realize that a single economic shock, a sudden layoff, or a change in a corporate algorithm can immediately cut off your access to the basic necessities of life. You are tethered to an invisible leash. The history of primitive accumulation proves that poverty was not a natural accident or a failure of individual character. It was a structural requirement. In order for a few to consolidate the means of production, the vast majority had to be stripped of them. The Enclosure Movement was not a tragedy of nature. It was a highly organized campaign to transform independent human beings into desperate, dependent labor. The next time you hear someone praise the self-made titans of history, look closely at the soil beneath their empires. The accumulation of massive capital always requires the active dispossession of someone else's security. The system does not merely generate wealth. It engineers vulnerability, ensuring that the worker has no choice but to return to the market every single morning just to purchase the right to survive. We must stop viewing the extreme concentration of modern wealth as a miraculous byproduct of innovation. It is the direct result of a centuries-old architecture designed to enclose what is necessary and sell it back to the desperate. The system thrives because it continuously finds new ways to separate us from our autonomy. The first massive fortunes were not minted from thin air. They were excavated from the ground beneath millions of ordinary feet. Chapter 3. The Legal Form of Violence. A well-dressed government surveyor steps out of a polished carriage and walks onto a muddy village green. He drives a sharp wooden stake deep into the earth and unrolls a massive map bearing the official seal of Parliament. With a few strokes of his ink pen, he erases centuries of local custom and shared survival. He does not carry a sword or a musket, yet he is executing one of the most violent acts in human history. Early efforts to enclose the common lands relied on crude physical force, with greedy lords simply burning cottages and driving peasants away. But physical violence is expensive, messy, and prone to sparking bloody peasant rebellions. The true masters of the English countryside soon realized that raw brutality was highly inefficient. To permanently seize the wealth of the earth, they needed a weapon much stronger than a private militia. They needed the majestic, unquestionable authority of the law. By the 18th century, elite landowners stopped fighting in the mud and took their ambitions directly to the government. They drafted quiet petitions demanding the privatization of entire villages. Because these same wealthy men controlled the votes in Parliament, their personal financial desires were swiftly transformed into binding national legislation. This was the birth of the Parliamentary Enclosure Act, a brilliantly disguised mechanism that turned outright theft into a respectable administrative procedure. When the parliamentary commissioners finally arrived in the village to enforce the new act, they appeared to be entirely fair. The scattered strips of traditional farmland were mathematically consolidated, and each family was officially assigned a neat, clearly defined private plot. To the untrained eye, the government was simply modernizing a chaotic, inefficient medieval landscape. But hidden beneath this rational redistribution was a devastating financial trap designed to crush the small farmer completely. The new law dictated that whoever received a plot of land must immediately pay a staggering share of the total surveying and legal fees. Furthermore, they were legally required to construct expensive, heavy wooden fences around their newly drawn borders within a strict time frame. For the wealthy aristocratic estate owner, these mandatory upgrades were merely a minor business expense. For a peasant barely surviving the winter, these sudden financial demands were an absolute impossibility. Crushed beneath the weight of bureaucratic costs they could never afford, the small farmers had only one option left. They were forced to sell their newly acquired land to the wealthy lords at a fraction of its actual value. The peasant was not chased off the property by a shouting nobleman on horseback. Instead, they were quietly pushed out by a politely worded invoice, demonstrating the terrifying effectiveness of structural economic violence. This procedural nightmare represented a catastrophic clash between two completely different worldviews. The peasants relied on the moral economy of custom, arguing that their grandfathers had grazed sheep on this specific hill for hundreds of years. The landlord simply waved a stamped parliamentary document and replied that the only thing that mattered was written contract and legal property. In the cold eyes of the new system, history and human need meant absolutely nothing without a deed. The transition from shared existence to private ownership induced a profound sense of helplessness. It is one thing to be robbed by a bandit in the dark. You can scream for the authorities. But when the authorities themselves write the rules that strip away your livelihood, there is no one left to call. The ordinary person realizes that the entire architecture of justice has been custom built to protect the very people who are stealing their future. We still live under the shadow of this exact bureaucratic maneuver today. Whenever a massive corporation rewrites its terms of service, or a financial institution buries a ruinous penalty deep inside a mortgage contract, they are wielding the surveyor's pen. The modern citizen is constantly forced to sign dense legal agreements they do not understand, surrendering their data, their privacy, and their rights to entities that hide their extractive power behind a flawless facade of civilized administration. The law stopped being a shield for the vulnerable and became a highly polished sword for the powerful. Violence does not always look like a bloody riot in the streets. Sometimes it looks like a perfectly formatted legal document resting on a velvet desk. It proves that the most enduring victories of power are achieved when the theft is perfectly written into the law of the land. Chapter 4. Efficiency with blood on its hands. A beautifully ordered, highly productive farm stretches toward the horizon, its golden wheat swaying in perfect symmetry. The heavy wooden fences keep the livestock completely separated from the immaculate crops. But standing just outside the heavy iron gate on a muddy, rutted road, a starving family watches the harvest they are no longer allowed to touch. This quiet scene captures the terrifying contradiction sitting at the very heart of modern economic progress. If we look exclusively at the cold mathematics of the national ledger, the Enclosure Movement was an absolute triumph of rational planning. From a macroeconomic perspective, it finally swept away the stagnant inefficiencies of the medieval world. But from a humanitarian perspective, this miraculous leap in productivity was achieved through deliberate, organized catastrophe. We are forced to confront the disturbing reality that a system can produce overwhelming material abundance while simultaneously creating mass starvation. In the old open field system, agricultural innovation was strictly paralyzed by mandatory village consensus. If a single farmer wanted to test a new seed drill or plant an experimental crop, he was blocked by the rigid rules of shared grazing. Once the fences were built and the land was fully consolidated, private owners could finally unleash an agricultural revolution. They began operating their vast estates with the ruthless precision of early industrial factories. The wealthy landowners introduced brilliant new techniques like planting clover and turnips to naturally restore nitrogen to the exhausted soil. For centuries, farmers had to leave a third of their fields empty every year just to let the earth recover. The new scientific crop rotations eliminated the need for rest completely. The soil was suddenly transformed into a perfect capitalist asset, operating continuously and yielding unprecedented surpluses of grain and healthy livestock. This created a deeply counterintuitive demographic shock across the English countryside. The rural population dropped drastically as millions of small farmers were evicted from their ancestral homes, yet the total volume of food produced by the nation skyrocketed. The landlords had successfully engineered a system that required far fewer human hands to generate far more wealth. The peasant was no longer the backbone of the harvest. He had become an unnecessary expense to be cut. This agricultural abundance was the vital prerequisite for the looming industrial revolution. A nation cannot build massive urban centers and fill them with factory workers if it cannot produce enough surplus grain to feed them. The enclosed farms pumped an endless river of calories into the growing cities, while simultaneously pushing the displaced rural population into those exact same urban slums. The fence created both the food and the desperate labor force required for the factories. We celebrate this explosion of productivity as the glorious dawn of modern civilization. But we rarely pause to define what the word efficiency actually means in practice. In the language of economics, efficiency simply means extracting the maximum possible output from the minimum possible input. When human beings are classified as the input, achieving ultimate efficiency requires systematically stripping away their livelihoods, their security, and their inherent dignity until only their raw labor remains. We see this exact same brutal logic celebrated in the financial headlines of our modern world. A massive global corporation will proudly announce record-breaking quarterly profits on the exact same morning it fires 10,000 loyal employees. The stock market immediately rewards the company with a surging valuation, cheering the sudden reduction in labor costs. The system does not view the mass layoff as a human tragedy. It views the destruction of those jobs as a beautiful optimization. There is a profound psychological trauma in realizing that the economy functions better when you are removed from it. The displaced farmers of the 18th century and the laid-off corporate workers of today share the exact same lingering existential dread. You follow all the established rules, dedicate your life to the work, and then watch helplessly as a new technology or a management consultant declares that your continued survival is a drag on the profit margin. The great myth of progress is the comforting belief that increasing the total wealth of a society automatically improves the lives of everyone inside it. But history proves that when production is tightly controlled by the few, technological breakthroughs often become weapons against the many. The silos may be overflowing with grain, and the financial charts may point toward infinite growth. Abundance means very little to the human beings who were systematically expelled to create it. Chapter 5. The Birth of the Free Laborer. A displaced farmer stands in a crowded city square, the cold rain soaking through his thin wool coat. He possesses nothing but the muscles in his arms and the desperate hunger in his stomach. He waits silently against the brick wall, watching wealthy merchants pass by in dry carriages, hoping someone will stop and buy his sweat for a few pennies. This broken figure represents the brutal birth of the modern working class. Economics textbooks often describe this historical transition as a glorious liberation, celebrating the creation of the free laborer. Freedom usually rings in our ears as a deeply noble concept. But for the dispossessed peasant wandering the English roads, this new status contained a terrifying double meaning. They were finally free from the binding obligations of medieval lords, but they were also entirely free from the land, the tools, and the security needed to survive. The architects of the new economy faced a stubborn psychological problem. When peasants were violently pushed off their ancestral commons, they did not automatically march into the dark factories. Many naturally preferred to wander the countryside, begging or hunting in the deep forests rather than submit to the crushing discipline of early industrial wage labor. The human spirit naturally resists the indignity of being reduced to a mechanical input. The state simply could not tolerate this lingering independence. To force the rural population into the new industrial machine, the government unleashed a series of terrifying vagrancy laws. By 1547, the law dictated that an unemployed wanderer caught a second time could be branded with a hot iron and sold into absolute servitude. The authorities criminalized the simple act of existing without a recognized employer. Over the following centuries, the state refined its cruelty through the infamous Poor Laws. They constructed bleak workhouses, where the conditions were intentionally designed to be unbearable, ensuring that a destitute person would willingly choose the most dangerous factory job just to avoid the poorhouse. The system first used the law to steal the peasant's land, and then it used the law to relentlessly punish him for being landless. This coordinated legal terror successfully engineered exactly what the new industrial capitalists required: a massive, desperately vulnerable labor market. Karl Marx accurately identified this tragic, displaced population as the Industrial Reserve Army, because there were always more starving workers standing outside the factory gates than there were machines inside. The owners could keep wages permanently at the absolute edge of biological survival. Desperation became the primary engine of profit. When a human being is stripped of all physical property and communal rights, they are left with only one remaining commodity to trade: their own labor power. They are forced to rent out their muscles, their waking hours, and their nervous system to an employer. The worker must sell pieces of their own life, simply to afford the calories required to wake up the next morning and do it all over again. We can clearly recognize this exact form of compulsory freedom operating within our modern gig economy. The platform driver or the freelance courier is constantly celebrated as a fiercely independent contractor, supposedly free to choose their own flexible schedule. Yet they are quietly driven by algorithmic penalties, hidden fees, and the relentless threat of unpaid rent to work exhausting, endless shifts. They possess the illusion of autonomy while remaining entirely captive to the system. True independence always requires a solid material foundation to stand upon. When the economic system systematically removes the ground beneath your feet, your freedom to negotiate disappears completely. You cannot bargain effectively with a powerful employer when the only alternative to accepting a terrible wage is immediate financial ruin and eviction. The architecture of modern economic compulsion remains perfectly hidden inside the glowing, optimistic rhetoric of personal liberty and individual choice. The profound tragedy of primitive accumulation is that it forces the individual to view their own body as a commercial asset. You are no longer a person embedded in a community. You are a standalone enterprise, trying to attract a buyer in a crowded marketplace. Your exhaustion, your stress, and your aging joints become accepted depreciation costs in the business of keeping yourself alive. The market demands that you continuously optimize your own biological machinery. We must look carefully at the vocabulary we use to describe our daily economic lives. The modern worker was not born from a glorious expansion of human rights. They were forged in the bitter fires of systematic dispossession. The fence drove them from the green fields and locked them into a perpetual cycle of renting their own existence. They were finally completely free from the land, which meant they were entirely free to beg for a master. Chapter 6. When the factory bought human time. A tired woman wakes in the freezing dark, her body reacting not to the dawn, but to the harsh, metallic scream of the factory whistle. Before the heavy smoke of industry permanently choked the sky, farmer survived by closely following the organic cycle of the seasons. You planted in the spring, harvested in the autumn, and rested when the deep winter froze the fields. The physical labor was undoubtedly brutal, but the peasant still maintained a fundamental ownership over the rhythm of their own daylight. The factory completely obliterated this natural relationship, introducing an entirely new method of human discipline to the world. The original Enclosure Movement achieved its goal by violently removing the rural population from their physical land. However, the rising industrial system required a second, much deeper form of enclosure to function properly. The factory system did not simply strip the worker of their ancestral fields, it systematically enclosed their waking time, their bodily movements, and their biological energy. The space of confinement moved from the fenced pasture directly into the fragile human nervous system. This brutal transformation accelerated in 1771 when Richard Arkwright constructed the first water-powered spinning mill in Cromford, England. This enormous building represented a terrifying leap in the architecture of production. The massive machines inside were incredibly expensive, and capital demands that an expensive asset never sits idle. Consequently, the water frames were kept running continuously, day and night, requiring a highly organized human workforce to constantly feed the hungry mechanical looms. The first generation of factory owners relied heavily on the most vulnerable population available. In Arkwright's mill, over 2/3 of the workers were children, with some as young as 7 years old. They endured grueling 13-hour shifts. The economic logic was brutally clear. Children possessed small fingers ideal for repairing delicate threads. They cost only 1/3 of an adult male's wage, and they were far less likely to organize a massive strike. The historian Edward P. Thompson identified this shift as a profound psychological trauma, noting that the mechanical clock replaced the sun as the ultimate authority. Time was no longer a flowing, natural experience, It was brutally sliced into rigid, measurable units that could be purchased and traded. Every minute spent resting or looking out a window was strictly calculated as stolen profit. The worker was forced to internalize the relentless ticking of the master's pocket watch. In the medieval workshop, the artisan guided the hand tool, intimately determining the speed and quality of the final product. Inside the new factories, the power dynamic was completely reversed. The roaring machine now dictated the rhythm, and the human being was forced to constantly match its frantic pace. As Karl Marx observed, the living worker was effectively reduced to a mere biological appendage of the dead machinery, stripped of all independent creative thought. When the displaced populations flooded into urban centers to find these factory jobs, they were met with unimaginable squalor. Friedrich Engels documented the horrific conditions of Manchester in 1845, describing families of 6 crammed into tiny, windowless basements. There were no sewers, and the raw human waste mixed freely in the streets with toxic chemical runoff from the looming textile mills. The city became a highly efficient engine for producing immense wealth and profound misery. The human cost of this explosive economic growth was measured directly in mass graves. In the working-class districts of Manchester, the average life expectancy plummeted to just 17 years, dragged down by staggering infant mortality. Even for those who survived early childhood, the average lifespan barely reached 32 years. Meanwhile, wealthy residents in cleaner neighborhoods lived significantly longer. This cruel disparity became the permanent biological price tag of early industrial capitalism. This extreme degradation occurred because labor power had been entirely transformed into a standard commercial commodity. When a person is completely stripped of property, tools, and the means of survival, they are left with nothing to sell but their own physical energy. They rent out their arms, their lungs, and their precious hours for a fraction of the value they generate. The factory owners bought human lives wholesale and consumed them to spin endless miles of cheap cotton. We often look back at the soot-stained walls of the 19th century with a false sense of modern superiority. Yet we still live entirely under the invisible dictatorship of the clock, the rigid schedule, and the relentless pressure to maximize every minute. The physical whip of the factory overseer simply evolved into the digital surveillance of the modern office. Our waking hours are still heavily enclosed by the relentless demands of a market that measures human worth in output. The machine did not merely process cotton. It processed the minutes and hours of human existence into a standard currency. Chapter 7. The Empire as a Global Enclosure. A heavy merchant ship docks in a gray English port, its wooden hull groaning as workers unload thousands of wooden crates. Inside these boxes sit the elegant commodities destined for wealthy European parlors: fragrant tea, fine cotton, and sweet sugar. To the admiring crowd on the docks, this represents the glorious triumph of global commerce. But they do not see the invisible blood staining the cargo, harvested thousands of miles away under the heavy barrels of loaded muskets. The brutal logic of primitive accumulation could not be permanently contained within the narrow borders of the English countryside. Once the system learned how to separate the local peasant from their ancestral pasture, it immediately turned its hungry gaze outward toward the rest of the planet. Colonialism was not merely a political project of planting flags on distant beaches. It was the ultimate global expansion of the Enclosure Movement, transforming entire continents into fenced private properties. In the year 1600, the British East India Company received a royal charter granting it a total monopoly on trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. This organization was never simply a peaceful gathering of ambitious merchants. It functioned as an aggressive military force, a ruthless tax collector, and a quasi-government possessing the terrifying power to dictate the survival of millions. The charter was simply a massive legal fence drawn across the ocean. The Dutch East India Company operated with an even more direct and devastating brutality. In 1621, they invaded the Banda Islands of Indonesia with a single, ruthless objective: to secure an absolute monopoly on the global supply of nutmeg. This rare spice commanded astronomical prices in European markets, selling for 600 times its original local cost. To protect this staggering profit margin, the colonizers systematically slaughtered roughly 90% of the native population. The traumatized survivors of the massacre were immediately forced into slavery to work the spice plantations. The colonizers understood that true wealth did not come from optimizing a supply chain or building a better brand. It came from utilizing overwhelming military violence to completely control the origin of the resource and then fixing the global price. The economic miracle of the spice trade was entirely dependent on a foundation of deliberate, calculated genocide. Throughout the 17th century, this dark architecture of extraction expanded rapidly across the entire globe. From the brutal sugar plantations of the Caribbean to the horrors of the West African slave trade, and from the cotton looms of India to the tea ports of China, a massive wealth siphon was constructed across 4 continents. Entire populations were violently separated from their own lands and local economies, forced into producing export commodities for a distant empire. The sheer scale of this colonial robbery completely dwarfs our conventional understanding of economic history. According to historical estimates, the British Empire drained roughly $45 trillion of wealth from India between 1765 and 1938. This unimaginable fortune did not evaporate. It flowed directly back into the banks and investment houses of Europe. This stolen capital became the critical financial foundation required to ignite and sustain the coming era of heavy industrialization. We are frequently taught that the Industrial Revolution was powered by the brilliant invention of the steam engine and the massive abundance of domestic coal. While technological innovation played a role, more than 30% of the early industrial capital actually originated from the staggering profits of this global colonial trade. The roaring iron machines of Manchester and Birmingham were fueled just as much by stolen colonial labor as they were by English coal. This realization forces a profound and deeply unsettling shift in how we view the elegant achievements of the modern era. When you walk through the grand gilded museums of European capitals, you are not merely looking at the rewards of superior cultural ingenuity. You are walking through the beautifully decorated vaults of a global extraction machine. The prosperity of the industrial center was intimately dependent on the manufactured poverty of the colonial periphery. The original Enclosure Movement taught capital how to separate the worker from the local means of survival. The colonial era took that same violent lesson and applied it to the global supply of raw materials and human bodies. By drawing arbitrary borders, establishing vicious trade monopolies, and deploying standing armies, the empire ensured that the vast majority of the world worked to enrich a tiny, distant core. The fence had finally encircled the globe. The wealth of the modern world was built by drawing a vast, invisible fence around the resources of the entire Earth. Chapter 8. The New Fences of Housing, Data, and Attention. A family packs their remaining belongings into a rented truck, driven out of their neighborhood by a sudden foreclosure notice. Across the country, a windowless server farm hums quietly in the dark, categorizing their financial ruin into a targeted demographic profile for eager advertisers. The heavy wooden fences of the 16th century have rotted away, but the brutal machinery of primitive accumulation is still operating flawlessly. It has simply learned to disguise itself within the sleek architecture of daily survival. After the devastating global financial crisis of 2008, nearly 10 million American families lost their homes to foreclosure. The banks aggressively reclaimed these properties, packaging the shattered dreams of the middle class as distressed assets. Massive investment firms swooped in between 2012 and 2016, purchasing tens of thousands of these single-family homes at heavily discounted prices. The very families who once owned their shelter were quietly transformed into perpetual tenants, forced to rent back their own neighborhoods. They now hand over a third of their monthly income to distant fund managers who have never walked down their street. The underlying structure of this transaction is virtually identical to the enclosure of the English countryside. A sudden crisis destroyed the assets of ordinary people, allowing highly concentrated capital to purchase the ruins at rock-bottom prices. The original owners became dependent users, trapped permanently beneath a newly installed, unbreakable financial ceiling. Once the physical earth had been entirely carved up, capital was forced to discover a completely new continent to enclose. It found this lucrative virgin territory deep inside the fragile human nervous system. Think about the social media platforms you use every single day. Every message you send, every photo you post, and every second you linger on a glowing screen generates valuable behavioral data. You believe you are simply communicating, but you are actively working the new digital fields. This vast digital commons is relentlessly harvested by algorithms running in silent server farms. The platforms collect, analyze, and package your deepest psychological habits, selling them directly to corporate advertisers. Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff accurately named this invisible extraction surveillance capitalism. You never paid a cent to use these platforms, but you are constantly paying with something far more precious than money. You are paying with your attention, behavioral patterns, and intimate social relationships. These scattered fragments of human experience have been quietly enclosed, forming the most valuable raw material of the 21st century. In the year 2023, the global digital advertising market surpassed a staggering $600 billion. The ultimate source of this astronomical wealth is the unpaid labor of billions of ordinary users. We generate massive surplus value simply by living our daily lives online, completely unaware that our private behaviors have been fenced off and heavily monetized. This digital enclosure is infinitely more elegant than the violent land grabs of the medieval past. Nobody forces you at gunpoint to stare at the glowing screen. You participate voluntarily, desperately chasing the small dopamine hits of social approval and digital connection. But the psychological architecture is meticulously designed to keep you trapped inside the walls. If you try to disconnect, you face profound social isolation and professional disadvantage. The invisible algorithms function exactly like the old wooden fences. Every single era defines its own commons, and capital relentlessly hunts down whatever remains free. In the medieval village, the commons was the shared pasture and the open forest. During the colonial era, it was the land and raw resources of distant continents. In the early industrial age, the commons was the natural time and rhythm of the human body. Today, the last remaining commons is the quiet space of our own attention and the privacy of our lives. This explains the crushing sense of claustrophobia that defines the modern human experience. You spend your entire day producing unpaid data value for a digital platform, only to return to an apartment where a corporate landlord continuously extracts your wages. You are squeezed tightly from both ends, enclosed by the physical reality of the housing market and the digital reality of the attention economy. The system extracts rent from your physical shelter while mining profit from your psychological vulnerabilities. We must learn to recognize the shape of these new barriers before we are entirely trapped. Primitive accumulation never ended. It simply migrated from the visible soil into the invisible data streams of the modern world. As the wheel of accumulation spins faster, we find ourselves increasingly separated from the ownership of our own daily reality. We have become temporary tenants in our homes and unpaid laborers in our digital lives, generating endless wealth for unseen algorithmic masters. The fence no longer stands in the muddy pasture. It runs quietly through the servers that predict your behavior and the leases that consume your paycheck. Chapter 9: AI and the Enclosure of Human Skill. A seasoned illustrator sits in the dim light of her studio, staring quietly at a glowing monitor. She watches an algorithm instantly generate a flawless imitation of a painting style that took her 20 grueling years to master. The machine did not learn to hold a brush or observe the subtle shift of sunlight. It simply absorbed her life's dedication, digesting her thousands of practiced strokes into an automated output she no longer controls. History refuses to remain safely in the past. We are currently living through the opening stages of the most intimate enclosure movement humanity has ever faced, unfolding in real time in the year 2026. The original landlords enclosed the physical earth to graze sheep for profitable wool. Today, massive technology corporations are enclosing the entire accumulated cultural and professional heritage of civilization to train highly profitable artificial intelligence models. In this new era, the raw material being fenced off is not a muddy pasture. It is human skill, specialized knowledge, linguistic intuition, and creative style. For decades, professionals like programmers, writers, designers, and accountants traded their specialized cognitive labor for a secure middle-class existence. They possessed a valuable inner asset that the market desperately needed. Today, tech giants are systematically extracting those precise skills, distilling human capability into proprietary machine intelligence. The extraction process is elegantly ruthless. A programmer spends 4 years in university and 10 years fixing code in a corporate office, slowly building a deep architecture of problem-solving logic. The artificial intelligence model silently ingests millions of lines of that exact code, mapping the intricate patterns of human thought. The individual programmer is gradually optimized out of the equation, distilled into a generic skill file that any executive can trigger instantly. The physical geography of the workplace is being radically rewritten. The bustling modern office, once filled with human beings arguing over design choices and analyzing spreadsheets, is rapidly being hollowed out. The displaced cognitive workers are sent home, and the expensive office real estate is quietly converted into humming server rooms. The human workers are legally and structurally evicted, leaving only the glowing machines to perform the labor humans once proudly owned. 500 years ago, the English peasants were pushed off the land, simply because the nobility discovered that grazing sheep produced a more valuable commodity called wool. Today, educated white-collar professionals are being pushed out of the economy because monopolies discovered a new, infinitely more valuable resource. The cyber wool of our era is compute, prediction, and digital tokens. The machine generates massive automated value, while the original human creator is stranded. We are repeatedly told that artificial intelligence is simply a magnificent tool that will enhance our productivity and liberate us from exhausting drudgery. But a tool implies that you actually hold the handle. When the system absorbs your unique professional identity, your specialized language, and your artistic style into a closed box owned by a distant monopoly, you are not wielding a tool. You are the raw material being harvested by a vastly superior economic power. During the early Industrial Revolution, a displaced farmer wandering the muddy roads could at least walk into a dark textile mill to find a new job. His physical labor found a new, albeit brutal, industrial buyer. But the modern professional class facing the artificial intelligence enclosure confronts a far more terrifying void. When your deepest cognitive skills are entirely absorbed into an algorithm, there is no physical factory left for you to walk into. You look around and realize the only roles left untouched by the predictive models are the heavily physical, poorly paid tasks of manual delivery, physical care, and basic logistics. The educated worker who spent decades mastering a sophisticated craft is suddenly reduced to the exact same precarious vulnerability as the 16th century peasant. They possess an impressive resume that the modern market suddenly regards as an obsolete artifact of a bygone technological era. The psychological devastation of this enclosure is profoundly isolating. You spent your entire life believing that your specialized knowledge was a secure fortress protecting you from the brutal winds of poverty. You traded your youth for degrees, late nights, and mastering complex professional workflows. Discovering that this fortress can be digitized, replicated, and rented out by a tech monopoly destroys your basic sense of worth. You feel as though your very essence has been casually pickpocketed. The central question of our time is not whether the algorithmic models are actually intelligent or conscious. The question is entirely about power, ownership, and the fundamental right to survive. Who holds the legal title to the intelligence that was actively manufactured from the collective effort of the entire human species? We are watching a handful of corporate entities draw a heavy digital fence around the creative legacy of humanity itself, claiming it as their own. When human cognition becomes the raw material for the next industrial revolution, the mind itself becomes the enclosed field. Chapter 10: Alienation, False Needs, and the Desire to Stay Inside the Cage. An exhausted office worker rides the evening train home, the carriage rocking gently in the dark. He stares blankly at his glowing phone, mindlessly scrolling through targeted advertisements for luxury lifestyle products designed to cure his lingering emptiness. He is too tired to read a book, too drained to speak to the stranger beside him, and entirely captive to the glowing screen. This quiet modern misery is the ultimate achievement of the Enclosure Movement. The philosopher Karl Marx observed that the capitalist system does not merely rob the worker of land, it robs them of their own human essence. He called this profound psychological wound alienation. In a healthy existence, human beings naturally desire to create, to see their own imagination physically manifested in the world. But the modern worker is entirely separated from the final product of their labor, performing fragmented, meaningless tasks dictated by a distant corporate hierarchy. You spend your waking hours building software you do not own, processing spreadsheets you do not care about, or delivering food you cannot afford. You are not expressing your soul. You are renting out your nervous system just to survive. Your coworkers are not a community. They are competitors fighting for the exact same limited promotions. By the time the evening train finally stops, you feel completely hollowed out, a ghost haunting your own daily routine. If the misery ended at the factory gate or the office door, the human spirit might eventually rebel. But the 20th century philosopher Herbert Marcuse identified a much darker evolution in the architecture of control. He realized that advanced capitalism had learned to enclose something far deeper than physical land or working hours. It had successfully enclosed human desire itself, ensuring that the exhausted worker would voluntarily maintain their own invisible cage. Marcuse argued that modern society manufactures a relentless stream of false needs. Through the sophisticated psychological machinery of advertising, media, and status competition, the system convinces you that your fundamental identity is missing. It then promises that you can buy that identity back in the form of a new phone, a designer jacket, or an exclusive vacation. You are trained to believe these desires are entirely your own, completely forgetting who originally planted them in your mind. This creates a perfectly sealed, self-replicating loop of voluntary exhaustion. You sacrifice your time and endure the crushing alienation of the workday specifically to earn a wage. You then immediately spend that wage satisfying the artificial desires created by the exact same economic system. You return to work the very next morning because you are instantly hungry for the next heavily marketed upgrade. You are simultaneously working like a machine and consuming like an addict. Marcuse called the victim of this cycle the one-dimensional man. You live in a world overflowing with dazzling consumer choices. Yet, you have entirely lost the ability to imagine a fundamentally different way of living. You can choose between 50 different brands of shoes, but you cannot choose to step off the treadmill. Your capacity for radical imagination has been flattened, replaced by a desperate, lifelong calculation of prices, discounts, and monthly credit card payments. We look at the victims of historical enclosure with deep sympathy, recognizing the violence of the wooden fence and the tragedy of the colonial port. Yet we look at our own lives and proudly call this endless cycle of anxious consumption true freedom. We believe we are making independent choices every time we tap our screens to order another package. We completely ignore the vast algorithmic architecture that engineered our cravings long before we ever opened our wallets. You must look closely at the architecture of your own daily exhaustion. When the alarm clock rings, you are not waking up to fulfill your own human potential. You are waking up to service the rent, to feed the data models, and to purchase the lifestyle required to soothe your own alienation. The Enclosure Movement did not end in the 16th century. It simply became the invisible atmosphere we breathe, shaping everything from our careers to our deepest romantic insecurities. Every era rewrites the fundamental rules of ownership to separate the many from the means of life. Enclosure took the physical earth. Colonialism took the global resources. The factory took human time. Finance took our shelter. Platforms took our data, and artificial intelligence now takes our professional skill. Through it all, the modern consumer society took our very capacity to recognize our own subjugation, substituting genuine human meaning with the fleeting thrill of the shopping cart. The highest form of oppression does not require armed guards, strict curfews, or heavy iron chains. It occurs when the oppressed actively desire the exact system that drains them, working tirelessly to reproduce the conditions of their own daily exhaustion. We are never more deeply imprisoned than when we mistake the comfortable padding of our digital cell for the open sky. The ultimate triumph of any enclosure is when the people inside the fence begin to defend it as the only possible world. If every age creates a new fence around what people need most, then freedom cannot only mean choosing inside the market. It must mean asking who owns the field, the machine, the home, the data, and the future. If this made the world look slightly different, stay. There is more coming. If the next enclosure has no wooden fence, how will you know when you are already inside it?